Citizenship is a question I've been interested in as long as I can remember. This comes from growing up in a political family where activism was a part of life. So it became an intellectual question because I wanted to understand why democracy works when it does work, why it fails when it fails. I wanted to be able to be an effective citizen. And for me, that meant I had to understand democracy. It wasn't enough just to act without knowing anything or without understanding anything. So in college, I learned, I hope, how to combine intellectual questions with practical concerns. I just finished a book on distrust, and I'm trying to understand both why our political life is characterized by so much distrust, especially interracial distrust, and secondly, what we can do about it, how we can get to a place of more peaceful interaction. There are two origins to this project. One resides in my experience at the University of Chicago. I was interested in teaching and working at this university because it was an elite Ivy League sort of ivory tower situated in incredibly interesting demographic contexts. I was curious about the relationship between the university and the predominantly African American community around it. The university had in the 60s and 70s a history of extremely bad relations with the community. I wanted to be there on site to think about how those relationships could be transformed. So simply being at the university has been an inspiration to think through how distrust can be resolved into trust. The other origin for this project came again when I was an undergraduate. Even then, race questions are big on college campuses all over the place, no question. And I was probably pretty naive in thinking about those questions at that point. I tended to invoke ideas like commonality and civic friendship and things like that, and probably too glibly. And I really angered a lot of my fellow African American students, and that anger was a surprise to me. So that anger, trying to learn how to think about it, was another inspiration to thinking about the problem of distrust and how to deal with it. The book has three parts, and the first part is a examination of the desegregation battles in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957. There are the famous photos I'm sure you've seen of Elizabeth Eckford being cursed by Hazel Bryan Massery in Elizabeth's attempt to enter Central High School. Those photos were all over the country, newspapers all over the country. They were also all over the world, and they mark a point where the collective consciousness of this country coalesced and settled around a commitment to advancing civil rights. So the first question the book asks is, why was that photo in particular so powerful and so affecting? And my answer there is, we see a young woman making a huge sacrifice for the sake of a common good, for the sake of shared ideas of liberty and equality. And the sacrifice was riveting because we don't like to think about sacrifice in democratic life. We prefer to think that democracy achieves happiness for everyone. We forget that even in just decisions, there's always going to be a cost somewhere being borne by somebody. So it's the ordinary costs of citizenship, the ordinary sacrifices citizens make for each other that I wanted to flesh out. So the first section addresses that question of the sacrifices citizens make for each other. The second section addresses why and how the sacrifices citizens bear are often converted into distrust or evolve into distrust if those sacrifices aren't properly acknowledged, properly handled, and so forth. And there I attempt what I call sort of collective autobiography. Why is it we democratic citizens think the way we do? Why are we so bad at seeing sacrifices, at responding to them, or responding to other problems of interaction? So through that collective autobiography, I make some claims about why we're bad at thinking about distrust in political life. And then in the third section of the book, I make a positive argument about what we might try to do about distrust. And I lay out tactics for interacting with strangers that I hope or think would help establish conditions of security where people can imagine new political possibilities because they have higher levels of trust and therefore can talk more productively with each other. My method of doing historical comparison is to try to tell a historical story in ways that readers will recognize features of their own lives in that historical story. So in my punishment book, I do explicitly talk a little bit about the American judicial system, but it's more important to me to describe the role that anger played in the Athenian system in language that will provoke a contemporary American to ask questions about how anger plays a role in our judicial system. So I write more by analogy than by explicit sort of reference to contemporary political context. And I think I will do the same thing for this book, that is, write a book about the problem of the future in democracy in such a way that it gives people questions to ask about their own democracy that might inspire some new thought about how we can manage problems of the future, information flow, generational transition, and things like that. The University of Chicago is an extremely exciting place intellectually. It is a place where it's easier to cross disciplinary boundaries. My colleagues in the classics department are reading my book and giving me great feedback about it, even though there's only a snippet about Aristotle in it. That's definitely something that the University of Chicago inspires more than other places. I think, though, that the University of Chicago has provided such a good example in this regard that other institutions are copying it. It's getting to be easier in other places, too, to cross boundaries. But I think that has a lot to do with all of the examples that have been set here at the University of Chicago in that regard.